All right, we are again in Daniel chapter 11. I promise we're going to finish chapter 11 tonight. There's a lot, and I didn't want to just kind of bum rush it at the end. So, Daniel chapter 11, we'll be starting in verse 21. And just once again, love is catching everybody up, just getting everything kind of remembering, what has happened. So you have kind of the end of Daniel's life. He has this vision. God has given him this vision, not a king, not somebody else, but God has given this vision. He's getting the explanation of it from an angel. And if you remember, the angel came to him. And he couldn't understand the vision. And an angel came to him, and through this explanation that we are now kind of in chapter 11. So we're getting some detailed explanation. And so the detailed explanation kind of really started in chapter 11, which is where we've been at, talking about Alexander and the generals just kind of coming in and just taking over Persia, moving forward. And then we moved on. Last week after that was moving on to Antiochus the Great. And so if you remember, we got kind of this kind of world powers going on. You have the kings of the south, which is the Egypt, kind of northern Africa area. And then you have the kings of the north, which is the Syrian kind of South Russia area today, right? So we kind of read through that, and it was the kings of the south going north, the kings of the north coming to south, and they were always waging war. And I gave you that huge chart to kind of keep you up to date of which one. You remember the kings of the south were all, first names were Ptolemies. Of course, that's not their real first name, it's just their king names. And then you have the kings of the north all started with Seleucus. And so you kind of have, when you're reading and you're trying to grasp these names and understanding where it fits at in history, that chart will help you kind of get through that. And we will finish that chart tonight with the biggest and the most important kind of guy at all. Now, and what's interesting is we've already talked about this kind of last king that we're going to talk about in this kind of north versus south area. This is Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus the Fourth. This is the little horn that was on the goat. This is the horn with the mouth, with the eyes and the mouth that talked. And so we called him the Antichrist, right? He was of course a little a Antichrist. He was against all things that were godly. If you remember, he kind of went through and he destroyed a lot of Jerusalem, and we're going to talk more about that tonight. But he was also a picture of the capital A Antichrist that is to come in the future. And so we've been referring to Daniel as kind of transitional lenses, right? Some things that happen in Daniel are really close. It's happening in real time in Daniel's time in which he's living in about the 600s. Then you have the middle lenses, it's not too far away, but it's not really close. And that's kind of really what we read last week. Kind of, even though Daniel was in the 600 BC area, we just went through last week a lot of the kings that are in the 300s and moving us up into the 200s BC. So it was definitely predictions, it was definitely prophecy, but it wasn't end of the times prophecy, which would take us to the top of our transitional lenses. That would be kind of that far future. And so tonight we're going to talk about the far future, but we're also going to talk about that mid-level transition lines and kind of get into the Antichrist tonight and kind of the compare and contrast and some of those. So that's kind of where we're at. We kind of left off with Antiochus the Great. And so now we are on Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus the Fourth. I would probably just refer to him as Antiochus the Fourth. Antiochus Epiphanes, it means, that word means to be the illustrator, because he was the great. But what's funny is, it's kind of in Jewish history, it says that all of the Jews would not call him Epiphanes, they call him Epidemides, which changes 2 letters, which meant madman. So he was Antiochus the crazy man, because he destroyed most of the Jews, and we'll kind of get into that. So if I refer to him as Antiochus the Fourth, that's kind of where it is, and that's the bottom of your chart on the right side, right? Because he was kind of the king, the ruler of the Syria, of the north side. So we're going to spend most of the time talking about him. And so just to catch you up, to remember kind of all that was happening in these times, we can remember last week that we had this king. Let's see here, break out our charts, right? So you have the kings, which is Seleucus, who became king. You remember he was poor. Their country was poor because for hundreds of years, they've been fighting wars and wars back and forth. And so when Seleucus comes on the scene, Seleucus the Fourth, he comes on the scene, he realizes, I have no money. There's no way I'm going to be a good king. There's no way I'm going to build my kingdom. So I need to be able to do this. And so if you remember last week, he went forward and he got an exactor, right? He put a tax collector, his name was Herodias, and sent him to Jerusalem, sent him to Israel to tax them. And I don't remember. I was trying to think today in my notes where I left off. I don't think I told you this, but if I did, you get it twice. Jewish custom, Jewish history tells us that Herodias actually goes into the temple to steal all of the gold, right? The candelabras, all the things, all the gold, all the treasure that Israel had. And when he got into the temple, God sent him visions of angels destroying him. And so he was inside of the temple, and he stopped and was like, no, I'm not going against God. And then what he did, he turned around, he went back north, and he assassinated the king that sent him. And so this king sent him to steal from Israel. God says, nope. And so he goes back and assassinates the king. So now we're without a king, which normally is just, right, it becomes who? The next heir to the throne, right? And so we kind of pick up right on verse 21 with this idea, right? So in his place shall rise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And so here's what's interesting, right? So you have this idea where Seleucus gets killed, and his next in heir is a guy named as Demetrius. Demetrius is in prison in Rome from one of the past wars. He got enslaved, and now he's in Rome. So there's really no true heir to the throne. So now we have Antiochus the Fourth, who is the uncle, it's kind of to Demetrius, and so he steps up and takes the throne. But what's interesting is exactly this kind of prophecy, this prediction, right? It says, "In his place shall rise a contemptible person to whom the royal majesty has not been given." He's not in line to heir, but notice he shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Some of your translation might say intrigue. And so he kind of smooth talks his way into the kingdom and becomes the king, even though he doesn't have a rightful heir. He's kind of like the brother of the brother, and he just works it. But by political kind of ways and flatteries, he moves in, and now he becomes the self-appointed king of the north, of this kind of Syria area, right? So he comes in, he does this. Verse 22, "Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant." So we can see here the armies are going to be swept away. In 181 BC, Ptolemy VII had taken the throne at age 6 under control of his mother. We kind of talked a little bit about this last week, but did I tell you who his mother was? You have a 6-year-old king. His mother is still kind of the queen, but she's kind of the acting she tells everybody. But his mother was Cleopatra. His mom was Cleopatra. So Cleopatra is reigning of Egypt, right? And so now you have a 6-year-old king, but mom's kind of helping. Cleopatra is kind of helping. And so remember, they send a kind of this marriage treaty. Hey, you like my daughter? I know you're 6 years old, but you can have her. And so that took place, right? So all this happens. And so we see that armies shall be swept away. And what happened is that didn't really work out. And so what happened, right? Sometimes later he moved into Palestine. He kind of comes down, and a huge army was defeated by Antiochus IV. So this young king, with Cleopatra the mom is helping him, they send some troops up, and Antiochus IV, kind of his first military kind of endeavor, wipes out the armies of the south in kind of this Israel area, kind of the Palestine, south of Jerusalem area. He wipes them out. But not only does he wipe out the armies, we notice I got so many pages going on up here. All right. Wow. So we notice in verse 22, it says not only the armies, but the prince of the covenant. The prince of the covenant, I put there in your notes, the Jewish high priest. I'll just tell you, this is debated by many scholars. If you were really to ask anybody, they'd say, you know what, we really don't know exactly who that is. But if you're going to take the consensus of most commentators, they're going to say that it was the high priest. We have some history of knowing that he was killed by a military conflict around this time, but we don't know for sure. But what we do know in this is that you have Antiochus IV takes out the army, and then he takes out this person, the Prince of the Covenant. And so we understand the covenant, especially in Old Testament, is always referring to the covenant of Israel and God. So it would be the Prince of God's kingdom, which does not refer to in the Old Testament ever in that way, except for this place. But in our knowledge of knowing history and of time, it would make sense that it would be the high priest of kind of Israel at that time. So not only does he take out the armies of the south, now he's taking out the chief guy of the nation of Israel. So you can imagine he's got himself in a little hot water. There's this young king who's just kind of self-appointed. He's kind of now on the scene doing some things. Let's see what happens. And from that time, that an alliance is made with him, that he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise the plans against strongholds, but only for a time. Okay, we'll stop there and kind of break this apart. So this kind of king, Antiochus, comes in, destroys the south, destroys the chief priest of Israel, and now it's kind of like, okay, well, we can't make the whole world our enemy at one time, right? So all of a sudden he starts being political again, right? So he starts kind of adding some things and helping some people. It says that he became a friend to the small. What that means is he became a friend to the poor. You guys remember the book or the movie Robin Hood, right? His idea was what? You would rob from the and give to the, right? Sound familiar? I'm just saying, right? Political times, right? It sounds so familiar, right? You kind of have this idea. This is what Antiochus did. And it says he's doing this. His father, his grandfather, no king has ever done this, right? You don't have the richest man in a kingdom would only hang out with the other rich guys. You wouldn't take from those guys and give to the poor. But Antiochus needed friends. He needed votes. He needed people to support him. So he's not going to get that within the walls of his kingdom. So all of a sudden he starts getting people outside of the kingdom, right? He starts getting people and he says, hey, if you come to Syria, if you come to the north, I'll give you this and I'll give you that. Sound familiar? Right? That happens, right? I mean, it's kind of real time, right? Kind of what we're living in. So you kind of have this idea of what he's doing. So he's becoming friends of the small, of the poor, and he's giving them everything. He's taking from the rich, not because he's trying to get power, but he's trying to get friends. And you can imagine, everybody loves free stuff, right? Did you hear one person complain about a stimulus package, right? A few of us, right, we're like, this is so dumb, this is going to be terrible for the government. But the poor, the people that loved it, oh my goodness, I'll take $4,000. That's $4,000 now, but give it 10 years, it'll be $56,000 in tax dollars, right? You kind of have that idea. So you start picking up all these small people, and that's Antiochus. So you can start to see his power is starting to grow, and you can imagine all the people that kind of swelled into his camp and, started, wearing these t-shirts and carrying his banners. So you can kind of see what kind of king he is. And you can see there that he was giving the plunder, the spoil, and goods. And so not only was he robbing from the rich, but in his war endeavors, when he would come back, he would now not take those war endeavors to the treasury and feed the government. He didn't worry about how much money the government had. He would give to everybody else. So you can kind of see the way that he was going. So in this, he shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. So in this, he's making promises that he knows he can't keep. Right? Sounds familiar, right? I mean, this is like political government 101, right? You're like, where does politicians come from? The Bible, man. They were there, right? Get everybody excited and make promises and do things and say you're going to do things that in the long term you're not really going to be able to do. You're just wetting ears, right? You're just tickling people's ears and you're saying, oh, that sounds so good. So he's making these plans for the strongholds, but only for a time. And he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. So we have this idea, he's growing his army, he's growing his popularity, but in his heart, what is he doing? He's going to march to Egypt. He knows what is coming, right? You can only promise things for so long and make promises for so long that eventually you're going to have to do something about it. And so Antiochus, North Syria, which is north of Israel, right? He starts marching down through Israel, through Palestine, through Judea. It moves, and he's literally at the border. I told you last week that all the kings before this, they never went to each other, right? The south never went to Syria, and Syria never went to Egypt. They would always fight in that Israel, Palestine, kind of that Fertile Crescent area, right? They would always fight there because nobody ever wanted to destroy their home. Here, Antiochus is doing something that nobody else has done, and he literally marches troops to the door of Egypt, right? To literally the country line, right? He is there. And so he does this, and the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. So he's there, he knocks on the door, hey, we're here to kill you, and the king of the south, he's no longer 6, the years have gone past, but he's still a young king. And he says, no, we're going to wage war. And so they fight war literally on the border of Egypt. And so even though Egypt is better and they're bigger, they lose. They lose the war at their door, right? So they lose this. They lose this. But he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised. And the reason that they lost is not because Antiochus IV was great, is because Ptolemy was betrayed by some of his own people. And so it's actually not Antiochus that killed the king, it was actually his own people that killed the king, right? So all of this is kind of in the works, it's all working. In verse 26, even those who eat his food shall break with him. This is talking about Ptolemy, his people that are going to kind of betray him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. As for the 2 kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. Imagine that, right? Now here's what's interesting, right? When we read this, and even last week we're reading about the king of the south, the king of the north, we're kind of going through all these wars. Remember what the whole book of Daniel is about, right? The whole book of Daniel is about what? God is in control, right? It doesn't matter if it's Babylon, it doesn't matter if it's Persia, it doesn't matter if it's Alexander the Great, it doesn't matter if it's Rome, it doesn't matter what visions, God is always in control. So you can see that even though we have these nations who are anti-God, who are against God, have nothing to do with God, God is using them, right? God has it, and he's working this all in his will that we will eventually see. Kind of like this morning, right? I love you. Will you marry me? Do you trust me with your future? God is using all of this war to produce a great future. And so, as for the kings, they're bent on doing evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. So they're going to kind of go in and do a treaty. They're going to kind of go in and bargain, but look what happens. They're both going to lie, and they both don't mean what they say. Politicians, man, I'm telling you, right? It happens, right? They go to this, and Daniel prophesies hundreds of years in advance. They're going to go to the table, but they don't mean it, and nothing's going to happen to this. And what happens? For the end is yet to be until the time that is appointed. God is in control. God has that appointed time. In verse 28, then he shall return to his land. This is talking about Antiochus, right? He's going back up to Syria. He shall return to his land with great wealth. But his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. So you can imagine, right? He wins, it's great, but what happens? He went all the way to Egypt. So now he has to march all the way up, right? He has to march all the way back up. And you have to go through Israel. So on this treaty that didn't work out, basically they're going to say a treaty, it doesn't work out, so he's mad, right? He was there, he won the war, but they do this kind of treaty and it doesn't really work out. So now he's marching north, walking through Israel, walking through all of this, and you can imagine, he's getting mad, now he's walking the whole way. You can just, when we get mad, the longer you think about it, the better you feel, right? No, it's the more mad you get, right? He has to walk all the way back home to Syria, the whole time walking through Israel. So in his heart, something starts to stir, and he is against Israel. He's against this holy covenant. And he shall work his will and return to his own land. At the time appointed, once again, right? God is in control. At the appointed time that God has, not that Antiochus has, that God has, at the time appointed, he shall return and come into the south. But it shall not be this time as it was before. He's not going to come down and beat the armies, right? It's not going to happen. It's going to be different. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. So he comes down again to go after Egypt, right? So he's there. They go on a treaty. It really didn't work, so he's marching north. He gets mad at Israel, and he's like, I'm going to get them, right? Israel's kind of this little gold nugget in the middle of a desert. So he goes up for a while, and now he comes back south, right? He comes back south to Egypt, all the way back down to the border again. And it says, now the ships of Kittim, which is Roman. So now he gets to Egypt, but he didn't know that now Egypt and Rome have signed an alliance. So Antiochus is a big army, and he destroyed Egypt once, but he's not big enough to destroy Egypt and Rome. Outside of the Bible, we see that history tells us that he gets there, and before he even arrives to the border of Egypt, Roman soldiers ride out to him, and they give him basically a cease and desist letter. It says, if you cross any farther, you're going against Caesar, and it's going to be on. And in this history, now once again, it's Roman history. It's not always accurate. This is what they say. They say that they drew a circle in the sand completely around Antiochus IV. And the Roman general said, you have to make a choice before you step out of the circle. Are you going to be for Rome, or are you going to go home and be against Rome? What are you going to do? And so basically, he realized he was beat, so he turns around and walks out of the circle, and now he's going back north. So he was south. The treaty didn't work out. He goes north, and he's kind of mad at Israel because he's walking through this beautiful land with all the money. He goes north. He rebuilds his army. He comes back. He's going to destroy Egypt again. Now they've allianced with Rome, and now he's been beat. He doesn't even get to fight a war. He's beat before the war. And so now he has to what? Walk back north through Jerusalem. And now, but he's been beat, right? He's not the victor. He's really mad. So you can imagine he's even more mad kind of at Israel, this place that they're working through. Verse 31, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. So this time, as he's leaving Egypt and he's going through Israel, he's already mad at them, he already wants them. So now he's going through Jerusalem, and we've already read this back in chapter 8 of Daniel. But we can see that now forces shall appear, things are starting to happen, and now he's going to take on. I gave you there the date, December of 168 BC, in Daniel chapter 8, verse 23 through 25. It says, at the later end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of boldface, one who understands riddles, the politician, right? This is Antiochus, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, because God made him great. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are saints. This is what he done, right? He destroyed Egypt and Israel as he was coming north. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper until his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and shall be broken, but by no human hand. So in chapter 8, we talked about this. As he's moving forth, he goes in and he destroys the temple, right? And so he destroys the temple. He makes kind of the altar, the abomination of desolate. And basically, the story goes that he goes into the temple, destroys everything that's in the temple. He sacrifices a pig on the altar. He makes all of the priests eat the meat of the pig, which would defile them. And then he destroys everything that would talk about God or Yahweh, and he erects a statue of Zeus and renames the temple of God Zeus Olympus. And so you can imagine, right? That's the action of this abomination that makes desolate, right? When you think about Jesus, and you think about Jesus talking about Daniel, Jesus quotes the book of Daniel twice in the Gospels, and both times it's about the abomination of desolation, or the abomination that makes desolate. So he's talking about this very particular situation and kind of giving it a prophecy forward. Okay, and we'll talk more about that as we go. So this king has come into Israel. He's mad because Rome and Egypt have kind of teamed up, and he comes in, and basically he's killing Jews, he's waylaying Jews. Basically, history tells us of all the Jews in Jerusalem, not in all of Israel, but all the Jews in Jerusalem, he killed half. Fourth of them he took as slaves, and the other fourth he took as concubines, sex slaves, right? So he killed half and imprisoned and enslaved the other half of all the Jews of Israel. So you can imagine what would happen. So he's in here. Not only does he desecrate the temple, not only does he stop sacrifices for Israel, which means now they cannot communicate to God, which means they no longer can sacrifice. They can no longer have this kind of chain to God, which means that they are no longer holy themselves, right? So these priests who are defiled because by sword he made them eat pig, they cannot go through the proper channels to isolate themselves, to wash themselves, to sacrifice the things that it needs, that the book of Leviticus would say that they need to do. So in one fell swoop, not only did he destroy the temple and the altar, but every religious person that could do anything about it, he wiped out in one fell swoop of making them eat barbecue sandwiches, right? Or bacon. That's what all you sinners eat, right? Just nasty bacon sandwiches, right? Ugh, so gross. And so you kind of have this idea. So he's a smart guy, right? I mean, he's a political kind of willpower, but in one fell swoop, he destroys all religion, basically the land in between Syria and Egypt. He takes them all out in one fell swoop. What was that? Okay, we're good. He shall, let's see, verse 32, he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. Notice this. he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. He shall seduce those Jewish people who give up on God. People who violate the covenant that says, you know what, I get it, okay, I don't need this. I don't need the temple, I don't need this, God's not important. What does he do? He pulls them to his side, right? He's pulling the small, the outcasts. That's what he does. He's pulling the small, the people that are around. He's doing that. He's pulling them in that are forsaking this covenant. But also he shall turn back and pay attention to those. I'm sorry. I just went backwards. He shall, and then people who know their God shall stand firm. So those who give up on God comes to his side, right? Comes to Antiochus' side. But there will be a small group that will hold true to the faithfulness of God, and they will rebel against him. They will fight. We've talked about this before. You can read all about it in the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, in the Apocrypha, which are historical books. They're not inerrant, they're not godly, but it'll give you a great history of kind of that Jewish time. And this all happens in between the time of the last page of the Old Testament and the first page of the New Testament, right? So you're right in there during this time. You have Maccabeus, and you have Judas Maccabeus that stands up and goes against him, fights against him, wages this war, and it's not long until later they get to tear down the Zeus statue, and then they get to come back to the temple, and they get to ceremonially clean the temple and restart sacrifices again. Okay, it's only a couple years that's in between there, but during this time, the faithful are fighting, and those who gave up on God are going to Syria. Right, they're moving north. They're getting promised stimulus checks and free healthcare. I don't know, whatever. Right, they're going north. So what happens, right? So that's what happens. Verse 32, he shall seduce with flattery. We said that verse 33, and the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. So while all this is going on, there's martyrdom, right? And the good people who believe in God, good Jews, are dying daily, right? They're truly in war against the strongest army of the world, right? With Antiochus in Syria. They're getting martyred, and Antiochus is making sure, right? Because Antiochus, in his mind, what does he want? He wants all the Jews to give up on God and what? And come to Syria, come to his side, right? So the more he can display them, the more he can martyr them, the more he can force them to renounce God, is the more that people will come to him. So, once again, he's not a dumb guy. This is a very intelligent guy. And so they are being martyred, verse 34. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help. And so that's that victories of Maccabees, as we talked earlier with Matthias and Judas. They come in. They're going to do well, right? They're going to have it. They get the rededication of the altar back in 165 BC. And many shall join themselves to them with flattery, and some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, made white, until the time of the end, for it still waits of the appointed time. So a lot of things are happening, a lot of things are going on, but it says until the time of the end. I put there on your notes, there's two positions of what this means, really kind of in the biblical world. One is that the persecution has its purpose, and God is using this to refine, and he's going to bring about his time. The second is that the persecutions of Antiochus are not the time of the end, even though they foreshadow them. So the mention of the time of the end is the notice that verse 36 and the prophecy leaps the centuries. And so what that means is some people believe that when it says at the very end, the times of the end, it's just saying that these are the times of Antiochus' reign, right? It's kind of his ends. The others, which I would fall in this group, right? Part B, the second part, is going to say that in your scripture, in the angel kind of telling Daniel the meaning, you can almost draw a line right here. Everything that we've read is happening in real time, 100 BC. Even though it's a prophecy for Daniel, remember Daniel's in 600, He's giving prophecy. It's happening. But here, right at this time, and in the time of the end, we're switching from the middle translation lenses to the very edge. We're seeing far in the distance. We're seeing way, way far in the future that has not came yet, right? The second coming. And so that's what that means. So depending on what you believe that to be, that's what it is referring to. So we get to verse 36, and the rest of my notes are written that 36 is that line. So I believe 36 forward is talking about the far future, the Antichrist that is to come, not the little a Antichrist, Antiochus the Fourth. Okay, so that's how my notes are. I believe that's the best interpretation. If you have another interpretation, we can fight that. All right, and so it'll be good. And so verse 36, moving to the top lens, right? So we have this. Now, what's interesting, if you go back in the book of Daniel and you read it all the way up until this point, to point verse 35, there's 135 prophecies that have come true. Okay, you can walk back of all these kings have been talking about and what they're doing. We can go back and we can historically prove. So from the very beginning of Daniel 1:1 till verse 35 of chapter 11, there's 135 prophecies. They've all been proven true. So now, verse 36, we're jumping to the far future. Okay, so if 9/10 of something is proven to be true, it's good faith, right? It's good belief to say, well, the rest is going to be true, right? As Christians, we're going to say, of course it's true. The Bible's true. But when you talk to people about prophecy and about is the Bible really true, Daniel is a hard book, but you can literally take it and prove 135 prophecies by historical measure. These are not spiritual measure. These are not godly measure. These are these historical facts that are in a lot of textbooks in public schools and public colleges, right? So we can take all these kings and treaties and place them all in place and just prove time and time again, right? It happens. So verse 36, we're moving to the future, right? Something that has not happened yet. So he's using Antiochus the Fourth as the little a Antichrist to kind of give us a vision of what the capital A Antichrist is going to be about. And the king shall do as he wills. Imagine that, right? And he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. And so we can instantly see kind of this beginning. He's going to exalt himself. He's going to magnify himself. And when you read about the Antichrist, there's really two places in Scripture that you go to, 2 Thessalonians and the book of Revelation. We're going to look at both briefly tonight. But 2 Thessalonians, talking about the Antichrist in chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, it says, "For that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed," that's the Antichrist, "the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God." So we can see, right, with Thessalonians, that's really about the Antichrist. It says, hey, the Antichrist is going to always say he's bigger and better than God. And right now we're back in Daniel, and he says this king, this Antichrist, he's going to do what he wants. He's going to exalt himself. He's going to magnify himself above every god, shall speak every astonishing thing. And it's amazing. You always find myself, what are the apostles thinking, right, when they're reading this? How does somebody do that? But now today, 2021, is it really imaginable that somebody could exalt themselves above anything else and the whole world would know instantly? Right? I mean, one tweet, one news clip, one video, and the whole world sees it, happens overnight, and every news station in the world is talking about a tweet. This is crazy, but it happens, right? So you kind of start to see, it's amazing how God just does everything and how it all comes to happen. So he's going to exalt himself above the true God. He shall prosper. Notice that. He shall prosper. The Antichrist is going to be, he's going to be a guy, right? He's not going to be poor. He's not going to be dumb. He's going to prosper. He's going to be up there. He's going to be on the Forbes list, I can assure you. He shall prosper until the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. And so we can see that the Antichrist, once again, What's the book of Daniel about? It's about God is in control. Even though he is the Antichrist, even though he is against everything that is God, God is still using that. God is still allowing that to happen. It's all working out in God's plan, right? And so we can see this. Not till the decree shall be done. Revelations 13. So we kind of have this, that God allowed, decreed that all this to happen. Verse 37, he shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. Now, we can stay here for 100 years, but we're going to get off chapter 11 tonight, okay? And so here's what happens. Sometimes you may have heard that the Antichrist is going to be Jewish. He's going to be a Jew. Where that comes from, it says he'll pay no attention to the God of his fathers, okay? So when you read that, it kind of gives a place say that says the Antichrist is not going to refer to the gods of his fathers. But when you go on to read, it says he shall pay attention to any other god. I would say that it doesn't prove that he's Jewish. It doesn't say he's not going to be Jewish. But what it does prove is he doesn't care about any religion. He doesn't care about anything. He's going to be the guy, right? And I've heard, we've all heard, right? I mean, everybody knows who the Antichrist is, right? It's going to be the Pope. It's going to be this. It's going to be whatever. Fill in the blank, right? Micah. I don't know. Whatever you believe, right? So you kind of have this idea who it is. But the reality is everything is below him, right? It's going to be God. It's going to be Allah. Fill in the blank. There is nothing that is going to be above who this guy thinks he is, right? So I wouldn't necessarily say that he's going to be a Jew. He could. I'm not saying this is a defining factor. And then another thing that we hear often is it says, or to the one beloved by women. A lot of times you'll hear people say, well, this is proof that the Antichrist is going to be a homosexual, right? I've heard it my whole life. You kind of have to say, well, this is proof, right? He's not going to be beloved by women. He's not going to give love to women. But what this is probably referring to, and all this is a lot of probablys, okay? But when you're reading it in the context of who this guy is, and with Israel, okay, the understanding of who Israel is, at this time, this understanding is he's not going to love women. It doesn't mean that he's going to be gay. It just means that he's going to kind of set on a part where everything is still below him. Okay? He could be gay. He could love women. But at the end of the day, he's going to be, once again, he's going to be like Antiochus. And we didn't get into Antiochus IV a whole lot. Antiochus IV had thousands of sex slaves, and you go through history, and basically any lady that would have sex with him, he'd only have sex with them once, and then he would sexually torture them to death. That's literally what he did time and time again for his very short tenure of king. So basically, several every night. So if you're using Antiochus IV as kind of this shadow of who the Antichrist is, it is really, a woman's not going to subdue him. He's not going to be under relationship. His focus is to be God, right? It is to truly be over the world. There's nothing that's going to be controlling him. He shall not pay attention to any other God. He will magnify himself above all. It's all about him. He shall honor the God of the fortress instead of these. He's going to care much more about war than women, than power, than anything, right? So he's going to be the God of fortress, a God whom his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortress with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him, he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many, and shall divide the land for a price. So funny. You could be here all day. Anyway, so you kind of have this idea that as he's growing and as he's moving, what happens? He's only going to let the people around him that loves him, right? He is literally the ultimate teenager, right? And he's just like, you don't like me, I don't like you. So what happens? How do you get in good with this Antichrist? The people that like him, he's going to load with honor. He's going to make them rulers, and he's going to divide the land for price. He's going to, we call this today politics, right? Hey, you come in, you rub my elbow, I'll rub your elbow, right? You give me some money, and I'll give you some money. I think for 2 years we heard the word quid pro quo, right? I mean, this is the idea, right? You come in and you support me as world leader, well then we'll start dividing land. We'll start doing some politics. So I'll give you this, and I'll give you that, and I'll give you this. You can just see what kind of leader he is. He's a politician, right? I mean, literally, flat, he's a politician. Verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind with chariots of horsemen and many ships. And he shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. So once again, right, we're using Antiochus IV as like a shadow of talking about the Antichrist. So in this dream, the angel is keeping this idea of the north and the south. It doesn't necessarily mean Egypt. It doesn't necessarily mean Syria. Once again, you can read this, and a lot of people have a lot of different ways, right? The king of the south is going to be somewhere in Africa. Could be kind of the Middle East, Iraq, Kuwait, kind of that area right off of Africa would be the south. And then most people will say that the north is going to be Russia, right? So you kind of have the Antichrist comes in, and what happens? Now you have the Middle East or North Africa. You have basically the Muslim area right there on the south. You have the Russians on the north, and now what happens? Them with the Antichrist are colliding, right? This is the ultimate world war. This is going to be the ultimate fight. It's kind of this big boom. Now, does it mean that it has to be Russia? No. Doesn't mean it has to be the Middle East. No. At that time, there can only be a north and a south, right? I mean, it can happen tomorrow. It can happen 2,000 years from now. We don't understand, nor do we have to kind of dive and try to think that we can figure it out. But what we do know is there's two world powers, and they're colliding right there in Israel, right? They're colliding in the middle. He shall come into the glorious land. He shall come into Israel. And tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand. Edom and Moab and the main part of Ammon, right? So for those of you who went to Israel, you probably remember standing on a mountain and you look over and you see the Megiddo Valley, right? If you remember, there's an Air Force base, Israeli Air Force base, the shape of a triangle. And on this side, you have some monster kind of mountains right here. And then you have this monster flat plain. And if you look past that plain, you can see the Mount of Transfiguration. You can see Bethlehem way far over there. It's on a good day. If you're there, this is what we're talking about. They're meeting in Israel in the Valley of Megiddo. It's where we get the Armageddon, right? The final battle. So you have the south, the north, the Antichrist is there. They're coming in for this big battle. What's going to happen? Thousands are going to fall. And basically the whole area is going to fall. But notice who doesn't fall. Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Which, if you know anything about history, these are three countries that were not good, right? They were made out of, these were people that were shunned by God, that went away. But what's interesting about these two countries is if you read into Isaiah, Isaiah tells us about that when Israel is restored, they will restore with them, what three countries? These same three countries, right? You have Edom, Ammon, and Moab. So it's just really, really interesting. He stretched out his hand against the countries. The land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and silver, the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. That's the west. You're right. I'm doing it all backwards. It's the west side of Africa, right? So you have the Libyans and you have the Cushites. So it's not just Egypt, right? The east part of Africa, kind of Middle East and Egypt, but now you have all of kind of the North Africa kind of coming up and going up into kind of the area of Israel. So all this is kind of coming together. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and silver, the precious things of Egypt. The Libyans and Cushites shall follow. But news from the east and north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destructions. And so this is that moving out to that valley of Megiddo, this Armageddon. So all this is kind of storming together, coming together. Now they're going to go into a final battle. And he shall pitch His palatial tents between the sea, the Dead Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea. That's kind of where we know we're at, right? So Israel. And the glorious holy mountain, which is Mount Moriah, which is where the temple stood back in the Old Testament. Yet he shall come to his end, and none will help him. And I gave you there that passage in Revelation chapter 19, where this final battle will happen and where the Antichrist will die. It kind of explains that in more detail about what's happening. So when you're thinking about the Antichrist, and you're thinking about this, and I haven't done this, so if you don't have your Bible, that's okay. But I do want to say, when we talk about the abomination of desolation, right? This is the two places that Jesus quotes Daniel when talking about the abomination of desolation. In Antiochus Epiphanes' time, he's there and he destroys basically the temple. Then when Jesus quotes it, both in Matthew 24 and also in Luke 21, we see Jesus using and quoting Daniel out of this. And I'm just saying this, and then we're going to end. And then if you want to discuss further, I'm definitely open, because I'm probably going to say something that you may have never heard before. And you're going to be like, what? And we'll question it. But when you are in Matthew 24, it's called the Olive Discourse, right? Jesus is there with his disciples, and Jesus starts talking about that the temple is going to be destroyed, right? That's verse 1, verse 2. The temple's going to be destroyed. It's going to happen. And the disciples say, well, Jesus, tell us when the temple's going to be destroyed. Jesus, tell us when you are coming back. Tell us when the end times are going to be. They ask really 3 questions, right? They're thinking it's all one. They think that the temple's going to be destroyed. Jesus is going to rebuild it. He's coming back. It's all going to happen. It's one time. And so when you read it, it's not all one time. And I know this is what I'm saying. A lot of times, you've probably heard a lot of preachers say that it's one time. And here's what I mean by that. In chapter 24 of Matthew, when we're talking about this abomination of desolation, right, using this word, I would say, right, and it's not just Sean, there's a lot of people that say that in this time, as you're reading through 24, sometimes you can think this is about the rapture, this is about the second coming, this is about this, and this is about this, and you can go a lot of places, and believe me, I've heard a lot of preachers go a lot of places. But if you're thinking about the temple being destroyed, right, that's what verses 1 and 2 is about. It's going to be destroyed, it's going to be a bad time. He's telling his 12 disciples, Judas is still there, right? He's telling his 12 disciples there's going to be a horrific time and it's coming. You need to be ready. The temple itself is going to be destroyed. Disciples' mind are thinking, for one, that's crazy. 2, okay, when the temple's destroyed, Jesus is coming back, right? Jesus is coming back. Remember, time and time again, they've heard Jesus say, tear down this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days, right? They've heard that time and time again. Jesus was referring to his own body, to death, and being resurrected in 3 days. But they're hearing temple, they're hearing this, and they say, well, when's the building going to be torn down? When are you coming back? When is all this happening, right? In their mind, one question, multiple questions. So Jesus answers in verse 24, kind of breaks it up, in chapter 24, breaks it up in really the 2 sections. But when it gets to this abomination of desolation, really starting in verse 15, right, where Jesus quotes this, notice this. He says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet of Daniel. Now, remember, what is the abomination of desolation? It's the abomination that causes desolate, right? It's a point where the temple is no longer the temple. The word abomination is used 100 times in the Old Testament. Every time it is used in the Old Testament, it is always used of the imagery of idolatry. It's putting something before God, okay? There's other times where we talk about homosexuality as abomination. There's doing this, but once again, you're putting idolatry. Sex with men is greater than God. Sex with women is greater than God. It's always in the overarching theme of idolatry, right? So this abomination, this idolatry is causing desolate, causing the temple to be gone, right? Causing everything to stop. So when you're speaking of this abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel, standing in the holy place, in the temple, let the reader understand. Okay, that's important. We'll come back to that. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in the house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray for your flight may not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe. For the lighting comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. He continues on talking about the coming of the Son of Man. We're not going to read that for time, right? You kind of have this. But notice verse 34, right? So he's in this kind of parable of fig tree, talking about this abomination of desolation. He says this, truly I say to you, right? Talking to disciples, this generation will not pass away until all of these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will not pass away, but my words, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So Jesus is telling his disciples, and he says basically, here's what's going to happen. The moment that you see the abomination of desolation in the temple, the moment you see the temple become obsolete, here's a whole lot of things that are going to happen, right? This is going to happen. It talks about earthquakes. It talks about this. And in this passage, a lot of people believe this is about the second coming, right? It's talking about the tribulation, then the second, second coming, the tribulation, then the second coming going forth. But he finishes it up saying, this generation will not pass until you've seen all of these things come true. How long is a generation in the Bible? 40 years. Right? They are talking to Jesus days before he dies. You can, depending on who you are, we're going to say Jesus died between 30 and 33 AD. At 40, you're around 70 AD. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD, right? So in this, when we read this, it's not, and I know it is why I open a whole can of worms, and even after Daniel, we're going to have a few weeks before we get into something else, so I'm probably going to carry on with this. But just open your eyes to this idea of abomination of desolation. He's telling them that the temple is going to be destroyed, and when it's coming, when you see it coming, if it was referring to the coming of the Son of Man, nobody could flee. Nobody could leave the rooftop. Nobody could flee to the south of Judea. Everything will stop. Everything will cease. What he's talking about. Even in Luke chapter 21, Jesus says this, talking about it. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, when you see them surrounded by the Romans, then know that its desolation has come near. Know then the temple will be destroyed. And so Jesus is not necessarily talking about his second coming, not talking about the tribulation of those passages. He's telling them that there's some bad things that are coming. Jesus, the good shepherd, is what? He's preparing his sheep for the next 40 years are going to be literally a living hell. That everything's going to stop. The temple is going to be destroyed. And so what's going to happen? They need to be ready. And we find out in church history of Eusebius, who tells us that when the church in Jerusalem, which were tens of thousands at the time, when they started to see Rome get smaller and smaller circle around Jerusalem, he tells us that the Jerusalem church left Jerusalem, they left Judea, and they went to a place called Pella. And there, the Jerusalem church even grew stronger outside. They saw what was coming, they saw the abomination of desolation, and they took Jesus' words, and they flee, right? They flee to Judea, and they went and they grew in Pella. So maybe it gives you a new view on kind of the abomination of desolation. Maybe it doesn't. Or maybe now you have 1,000 questions, right? Whatever it is, we're going to pray on that. Father, we love you. We thank you so much. We thank you for your word. We thank